Professor Elizabeth Simmons. Elizabeth is currently the Executive Vice Chancellor for UC San Diego, the equivalent of our provost here. And she recently moved there from Michigan State University, where she was the Associate Provost for Academic and, Faculty and Academic Staff Development. And more importantly, she was the Dean of Lyman Briggs College for quite some time, and which is a residential college there, and similar to the philosophy of Brown, where the studies of science is done in a historical, philosophical, and sociological context. She's also a member of AAAS, has won numerous awards, which I'm not going to go through, but recently she was elected as the Division Counselor for DPF section of APS. Congratulations, because this just happened about a week or 10 days ago. Yeah. So, Professor Simmons graduated with a PhD in theoretical physics from Harvard University under Professor Howard Georgi. She was a faculty member at Boston University, where we crossed paths. I was at BU before coming to Brown, and when I joined BU as a junior faculty member, she quickly became a friend and a mentor, and she remains until this day, so I'm really thankful for that. Professor Simmons' research is in the theory of electroweak symmetry breaking, which gave us the Higgs boson, and the physics beyond the standard model. She has co-authored 100 or more peer-reviewed publications. But today, she's going to speak about promoting gender equity in STEM theory and applications. So beside her particle theory research, Liz has been thinking about furthering education and promoting diversity for a very long time. And at BU, she founded the Pathways program, which was a day-long program and a STEM workshop for high school girls. And as an assistant professor, when I first joined and the first Pathways occurred, she, of course, every STEM female faculty was involved across campus in this, and it was really impressive. I hadn't imagined hordes of buses with schoolgirls from every place in Massachusetts just arrived, and I was, okay, this is what it is. And we did this together for almost 10 years. Yeah. And I learned, so her energy and enthusiasm for making science accessible to everyone is very remarkable and contagious, and I learned quite a bit from her, how to promote science and gender equity. And I also want to mention that at MSU, as the head of the Lyman Briggs College, she led transformative changes and started many initiatives to improve teaching and to create inclusive college environment. And in recognition of that, the MSU Excellence in Diversity Award was given to her in 2012. Professor Simmons is also a co-author of the recent LGBT climate report commissioned by the American Physical Society in the last year. She also is a good writer. She writes a regular column, Mend the Gap, for Inside Higher Ed, and is a 2017 top writer on Quora. Who knows Quora? You can ask any question. So she's one of the top writers there. And in one of her columns in Mend the Gap, I read sometimes her columns, she said that all science exists within a human context, and I really agree with that. So a few months ago, I heard her give a very inspiring talk at the meeting of the DPF of APS at Fermilab, and it was in June or July, sometime like that, and it was on diversity and inclusion in physics. I could not resist after that inviting her to come here and share her experiences with us, which is, given the heightened dialogue about diversity and inclusion on campus, it is quite appropriate to have her colloquium at this point of time, and I'm glad that she agreed to come to Brown today and give us a colloquium on this topic. So please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Simmons, who will speak about promoting gender equity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Meenakshi. Yes, we had a good nearly decade working together on Pathways, and then Meenakshi started her own separate Pathways program that carried on for a number of years as well. Let's see. So why are we here today to have a conversation? I know why I'm here. I'm here because all the way through high school, through graduate school, postdoc, and well through my assistant and even associate professor years. You've heard that I've had honors and I'm a professor and I'm a provost and all these things. But back in the day, I was subjected for years to sexual harassment, assault, bullying, stalking. And I came to realize over the years that pretty much all of the women physicists I knew had had similar experiences, unfortunately. And as I got to know more colleagues who were either members of racial and ethnic minority populations or sexual and gender minority populations, their experiences were, if anything, even more distressing than mine because they were getting attacked on even other grounds. So I've persisted, I'm still here, and over the years, my experiences and those of others made me realize it's important for us to talk about these things because we haven't talked about them in our society, and that's, I think, why things have persisted. So today I want to talk with you about what is the situation in physics right now as regards physicists who are not in the majority, and how did we get here? What can we do? How can we change things? So theory and applications. These are statistics you may have seen from the American Institute of Physics Statistical Research Center, and they show that there has been there was for many years at least a relatively steady rise in the percentage of bachelor's degrees in physics being awarded to women as well as doctoral degrees. You can see that about over the last decade, the percentage of bachelor's degrees going to women has declined again. It's in a period where the number of physics degrees, bachelor's degrees being awarded, actually increased, but the number of men was increasing, the number of women stayed more constant, and so the percentage went down. And if you look in comparison to other areas of science, you see that physics, unfortunately, is in this light green color down here next to engineering. Even though our percentage has been climbing, it's really not that impressive when you compare what's happened in the life sciences, for example. And one would wonder, why haven't we done as well as the life sciences? Why aren't we seeing more parity? Now, if you look at the numbers for Hispanic and African American physicists, you see that there has also been change over the years, and you see the numbers 18 and 21, and you remember there was about 20% on the last slide, and you think, wow, that's really pretty impressive, until you realize this is head count. This is not percentage, and the other was percentage year by year. This is head count in 6-year blocks. So it's really not impressive. In fact, it's really horrible that that's the number of new PhDs, African American and Hispanic, in 6-year blocks. And if you similarly look at physics departments and how many women faculty there are, but broken down by how many in a given department. And so you see that the percentage of PhD granting physics departments, and it's broken down what percentage of them have no women whatsoever, when the average size of these departments is 29 people on the faculty. And you see that things have gotten, in 2010, they were somewhat better in blue than they had been in 2006 in gray. But still, in more than half the departments, fewer than 10% of the faculty are women. And many individuals are working in a department where they're the only woman, or maybe there's one other. And so day by day, whenever they're in a room, in a meeting, they're the only woman. And that was often my experience at BU for many years. It wasn't till I was at Michigan State where there was a higher number. So the probability that there'd be a few of you in the faculty meeting at once kind of went up. So it's, and again, if you think about what things look like, this is faculty broken out this time by, this is only women faculty, but it's broken down by race and ethnicity. And you see the gray numbers, these are again head count. The gray numbers are for individuals who identify as white, the blue Asian, the green African American, the red Hispanic. And you see that the numbers really are not where we'd like them to be. If you think about maybe looking at the idea that maybe you'd hope that there was some sort of parity with how things are in the general population, then you'd say in the general US population, I think that African Americans are presently about 13% of the population. So you would have expected that out of all of the, say, the faculty in this column, if you add them all up, you might have expected there to be about 75 African American women faculty, and the number is 14. And so again, we're not really doing as well as we ought to be. And with 14, the individuals are then spread around in different places in the country, again, being the only in the department, most likely. The APS actually was interested enough in this topic to make a website where they actually listed out kind of red flag issues that might be things that show you that things aren't going as well in a department as you might hope, that the climate was maybe an issue. And there are things that you might have expected, derogatory comments or decision-making processes not being transparent. But I thought that one of the really interesting ones was the one that I highlighted in red up at the top. Denial that there is a problem, unwillingness to even talk about the topic. And so that's why I'm really glad to see that there's so many people here today who are interested in talking about the topic and spending a bit of time on it, because that's what makes it possible for change to happen. So why are we here? So let's take that in a different way. We've seen what the statistics are, but what led to those statistics? How did we get here? And it turns out there's a lot of social science research that sheds some light on this. And so I'm going to review a bit of that, and then in the last part of the talk, I'll talk about some specific efforts that I've been fortunate enough to be part of that show what you can do to try to help things change over time. So one of the big things that has led us to the present situation is we're human. And in anything that we do, there are different parts of our brain that are involved. The book mentioned on the left of the slide, Strangers to Ourselves, talks about how, for example, as I am speaking to you, there's a conscious part of my brain that's deciding what I'm going to say and how I'm going to order the words. But there's also the unconscious part of my brain that is keeping me breathing and helping me when I've decided what I'm going to say. It tells my tongue and my lips and so on what to do, what all the muscles should do, so I don't have to think about how I will form each word. And so there are, that means that whenever we're doing things, as much as possible is relegated to these subroutines in the background. And they're very helpful when we're going to speak so that certain things can be done automatically. And they're helpful also as we simply walk around so that we don't, we recognize that's a chair, or we don't trip when we walk up the stairs. But unfortunately, some of that, those automatic subroutines lead to our recognizing patterns that maybe aren't really there, are making associations that aren't really accurate. And we may not realize that we're making those associations simply because of things that we've been hearing all our lives or seeing in the media. And those things lead to what's called then unintentional bias, implicit bias. There are these books like Blind Spot about this, Whistling Vivaldi about, by Claude Steele, which I urge you to read if you haven't read it, about the topic of stereotype threat and how when we know that we belong to a group that society views in a particular way, we can tend to be forced to act in ways that, that tend to confirm the stereotype, even if it's against our interests. So in taking a math test, if something happened to remind me that I was a woman and women aren't really supposed to do that well at math, it could actually suppress how well I would do at the math test, not just me, but anybody. So all of these things due to these subroutines in the back of our mind. And the sad thing about it is that, we all have these. So if I take the implicit associations test, for example, online, which I've done, I find out that I have these same stereotypes, including the ones that make me think that women aren't as good at math as men. I personally, when I'm thinking about it consciously, I know that that's not true, but unconsciously, the way the test looks at it, I have those same issues as everybody else. We all do. So our being human and our having these subroutines in the back of our mind is part of what has led us to this situation where there isn't gender parity in physics. But our beliefs about what it takes to be a good physicist are also part of the issue. A lovely study was done surveying members of different fields and asking them, to what extent is it true that in your field you can learn the field and hard work can take you to the top of the field, or to what extent do you just have to really be born good at it? And when they plotted the tendency for this prevalence of belief that special, innate talent or brilliance is required, physics is right out here, and there's this really strong correlation or anti-correlation with the percentage of people getting PhDs who are women. When it was done in the humanities, philosophy was our twin, way out here compared to a lot of other fields. So that's another component of what's going on. And the funny thing about this, of course, is if we really believe it's all inborn, why are so many of us in this room spending so many of our waking hours teaching classes in physics? So it's not really totally logical, is it, right? But that's how the brain works. There have been a lot of studies showing, and my theory is that the slides will be available somewhere online. You can go get all the references and look at the details. So I'm not going to go into every detail of every slide. But basically, this is a famous old study looking at applicants to a postdoctoral fellowship program. And when they went and analyzed the data from years past, they realized that the female applicants had to have many more objective accomplishments in terms of papers published and the impact factors of where they published it than the men did to have the same chance of winning the scholarship. And one could say, well, that was a while ago, and maybe that's not true, and that was in Sweden, and maybe this is the United States. And one can make lots of excuses. A more recent study was done looking at the likelihood that men versus women would be awarded grants. And yes, admittedly, this one is also again in Europe. But one thing that was shown was here are the ones where a higher proportion of men got the grants from a panel awarding a set of grants is each dot. Here are the ones where women turned out to get a higher proportion. And on this axis is the share of people on the awarding panel who were women. And you see, there's no pattern. Having more women on the awarding panel didn't change things at all because women have the same implicit bias as men. There are similar results about from the US, in case people are wondering if this is just a European thing, similar results showing that if you looked at patterns of who scientists were likely to hire and mentor in their labs, again, that same sort of bias was evident when people were shown basically the same CV with just either a male-sounding versus a female-sounding name attached to it. And people definitely said, oh, yes, I want to hire him very much. And her, they weren't so interested in. But it was the same fake CV. So the result is when you look at, as there was the special issue of Nature a few years ago, when you look at what happens to patterns of winning grants or and the size of the grant and salaries, and this is aggregated across biology, chemistry, and physics. The numbers for men are in yellow, the numbers for women are in red, and you see women getting smaller fraction of grants, smaller size grants, smaller salaries, and so on. So there are real effects to these patterns when they go on for years in people's careers. And looking around the world, as the American Institute of Physics global survey of physicists did, showed that if you look at the kinds of experiences that people need to advance in their careers, things like getting to give a talk at a conference as an invited speaker, editing a journal, and so on, you see that no matter the economic situation of the country, whether it was very highly developed or a less developed country, the pattern was the same. Men were having more access to these different kinds of experiences than women worldwide. So how does one get away from this? How does one try to make a difference? A lot of the solutions come down to, well, the big thing is simply talking about it, as your university is doing. You have extensive websites. I know you're doing extensive planning exercises. The president or the provost talk about these things and make them a priority. That gives permission for everybody else to talk about it and raise their concerns. That's incredibly important. But then going through and having an institution look at all the processes that it goes through to admit students, to hire staff, to hire faculty, and make sure that the processes are actually fair, that they look at evidence instead of gut reactions, because gut reactions go back to the back of our brain where our biases live. And looking carefully at evidence, that brings our conscious brain that's a little bit more analytical into play, and leads us to fairer outcomes. So there's all sorts of research on exactly which sort of methods work, but that's sort of the basic summary of it. And it's also helpful if professional societies like American Physical Society or American Chemical Society offer professional development workshops to women and members of other marginalized groups. So they have a chance for some of the networking and basic career advice that they may be less likely to get in their home units, being perhaps a bit less plugged into the network or not as looked after as much by mentors. So then there's a whole other area, dual career couples. Now this one, the study that I could find is one from back in the 1990s, at a time when the only legal marriages were between people of opposite gender. So this is an inherently gendered study, and I apologize that I don't have more recent data on that. So this was looking, you might say, well, in that case, if you're only looking at couples where a man is married to a woman, they're both married to each other, so if there's a dual career issue, shouldn't they both be impacted? And that sounds logical, except turns out that's not really quite how American society is constructed. On average, in man-woman couples, the man is a couple years older enough to be a little bit more senior in the job. And it turns out that among physicists, a very high percentage of married physicists have scientist spouses. So that's the red number there, whereas the blue number is for the married men physicists, much lower fraction married to scientists. And in fact, the percentage who are actually married to other physicists is also quite large within that. So it turns out then when in addition to getting the numbers, there was some qualitative research done as well. And it turned out that when people were going and looking for jobs, since the man in the couple was more senior, it was more likely that his career was going to determine where the couple went, and the women were more likely to end up unemployed or underemployed. So something that seemed initially like it would treat both men and women the same, because of societal structures, wasn't. There are a lot of things that one can do around the hiring. that in principle could help this. One could have, employers can have gender-neutral policies for hiring spouses and partners or offering them opportunities. And if they're gender-neutral, then that helps everybody, especially in light of today's more modern marriage laws. Employers can try to really invest in both members of the couple, not just one, because if you're hiring two people, you want them to both succeed. Otherwise, what was the point of hiring both of them? And really, for a lot of employers, thinking about this as a way to actually recruit people you might not otherwise attract by paying attention to both halves of the couple can really be a plus. So it turns out that when you keep looking at these sort of dual career issues, there are other dimensions, like how people spend their time. And again, this data is a bit older, from before marriage laws were reformed, and things are all couched in terms of the gender binary. But what it shows, and you look at time that people spend on professional work, housework, and caregiving, and the most striking thing is if you contrast the people without children with the women with children, you see that, well, first there's this huge part of caregiving there, which is a lot of hours per week, whether it's caring for elderly parents or for children or what have you. But the other thing you notice is that this is about 60 hours per week on professional things. This is one full 8-hour day less per week. That's a lot less time to be working on grant proposals or preparing for class or whatever it is that we're doing with our professional time. And so even though everybody is spending a lot of hours each week doing things, people in this bin are being overall more overworked and having simultaneously less time for their professional duties. And week after week, year after year, that takes a toll on how much stuff one gets done, because there's only a finite amount of time. Turns out, very similar if you look around the world, so back to this global survey of physicists, if you look in red and see who's doing the housework, again, you see a similar pattern where the women physicists much more likely to be spending time on housework than the men physicists around the world in different countries. Having children, again, this data from, drawn from an NSF survey and analyzed by a team at the University of California, and turned out that if you looked at, this is the likelihood in a given year that you got a tenure track job. This is not just physics now, this is any academic field, and so you see that which is why it's a couple years out from your PhD that people are getting tenure track jobs, because it includes, say, humanities fields where actually that is the pattern, because postdocs are less likely. But you can see all the curves are essentially the same shape, but in any given year after the PhD, married men with children are 50% more likely to get that tenure track job than married women with young children, which is really fascinating. The married women with no children are still not doing as well as the married men with children. So again, this impact is clear. And again, same sort of pattern if you look at the data from the global survey as to how fast people are progressing in their careers. There was the Nature special issue reported something very specific. There was an interview of people who were postdocs, and they were asked specifically, these are postdocs who had decided not to go for a research career in academia. And so it turned out that so it was about, among people who had no children yet and no plans to ever have kids, it was about 20% of the men in yellow who said, yeah, I don't want an academic career. And about the same fraction of the women. But if you advance along the, if the children got closer and closer to the real sheet, so to speak, to where maybe you actually had new children since the start of your postdoc. Didn't matter for the men. Still, that same 20% said, yeah, I'm not going for an academic career. But among the women, the more likely you were to actually have young children in your life, the more likely you were to opt out of an academic career. So there's something about how we structure family in this country that makes it seem incompatible with being part of academics, which I think is disturbing, since it would be nice to think that it's possible to have a full life while being an academic. I've been able to be married, I've had children myself, I know it can be done, but I know that the fact that my husband was willing to literally change half of the diapers and stay up all night half the time with the kids when they had the stomach flu and all of that, that was essential. Because otherwise, you know, I never would have gotten any sleep, and it would have been really hard. And I think that employers can also be, have ways of being more supportive, making sure that backup child care is available, or backup elder care as well, if that's what's needed. Just to go in another direction, there's negotiation. We all have to negotiate things every day. We have to help make decisions about where we're going to go to dinner or who's going to cook dinner. On the job, we have to negotiate lab space or which courses we're going to teach. And this is particularly important right at the time where we're being offered a job. Now, it turns out that women, the social science research shows that women are less likely than men, at least in this country, to realize that a negotiation is happening, that negotiation is possible, or to feel comfortable conducting a negotiation, or to feel competent to do it. And as a result, men are more likely, statistically, to ask for what they actually think they need to be successful, and to ask for a bit more than the women do. And since usually, you know, if I ask for this, the other person's probably not going to give me everything I asked for, and we'll end up somewhere in the middle. If the men are asking for more and the women are asking for less, and they don't get everything they asked for, by the time they finish this whatever negotiation happens, the men have come out with more salary, more lab space, and so on, if everything is completely open. And because people don't necessarily talk about starting salary or size of startup or things like that, no one may actually realize what disparities are there, maybe until years later. Now, it turns out that, that when women do negotiate, they tend to use the more promising form of negotiation called interest-based negotiation, where instead of staking out a line in the sand and saying, I must have this widget for my lab or else, they instead are more likely to say, I need to be able to do this kind of experiment. How can we give me access to the facilities I need to do this kind of experiment? And then that opens up all sorts of possibilities besides buying that one widget. So using interest-based negotiation is great. Women tend to do that. The problem is trying to get them to start negotiation in the first place. And so, and this plays out in who, again, around the world, the global survey showing who has access to equipment, lab space, funding, and so on. Again, this same pattern of men negotiating more for this and winding up with better access to professional resources. But it turns out that there are ways to solve this too. Simply getting people to read a book about negotiation or going to a workshop where they will practice negotiation. So when I first became a dean and started hiring people, my very first year, I'm sitting across the table from a faculty candidate. I'd never done this before. I had no clue. Neither did they. It was fine. We were equally ignorant about how to negotiate. 3 years later, I'm hiring, yet another crop of faculty, and now I'm bewildered. I know how to do this negotiation thing. The person across the table from me is brand new and clueless. And I realized that was a problem for me. because they didn't know how to ask for what they needed to be successful as a faculty member. And since I wasn't just hiring physicists, in my role as dean, I was hiring philosophers and chemists and historians, I might not know what they needed either. And so I wrote up a tip sheet, and I gave it to them before they negotiated with me. And the tip sheet explained, here's how to negotiate, and this is not adversarial, and you need to tell me what you honestly need, or we're not really going to figure this out. And the tip sheet was a success. And so I wrote a piece for Inside Higher Ed and published it. And when I would, I'd call somebody and say, I'm going to offer you the job, and here are all the details, and go read my article. And they would come in and they would say, okay, just like in the article, here are the 6 things I want to talk about. Here's the most important one. Here's the, well, it would be kind of nice, but I could live without this. And then it was great. We could have a real conversation, and we would both benefit, and it wasn't all awkward and adversarial anymore. So just doing that at a local level, it actually helped tremendously. And it meant that it didn't matter the personal characteristics of the person across the table from me. They were now all prepared, and they knew what the game was, and that it wasn't a game. It was just a conversation. So there are things like that that you can do. If you're a mentor of students and postdocs, sit them down and talk to them about what the process is supposed to be like. So when they're negotiating their first job, they'll know, and it won't be something mysterious to them. So that was all the theory. I'd like to talk for a few minutes then about a couple areas where I've had the chance to collaborate with some other people to work on trying to change the gender imbalance in physics, at least to some extent. And the first one is a workshop that I've now run 3 times with my collaborators at the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, which is a beautiful place to go run a workshop. But more than that, ICTP is dedicated to bringing physicists from the developing world fully into the mainstream of physics. And when we approached them back in 2012 to ask about the possibility of doing this workshop for women physicists from the developing world, they saw it as fully in line with their mission and agreed that we could try this. So we've just done our 3rd, we're planning for the 4th, and ICTP is opening up new locations. We're hoping to run the workshop there as well. So I've done this together with one of my best friends from graduate school, Shobana Narasimhan, and it was her idea. We were together at one of the international women's conferences in, I think it was the one in South Africa in 2011. She came up with the idea for this, and we made it a reality. And so here's, from the 2015 workshop, here is the group of women participants. They come from many countries in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Latin America, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, really from all different parts of the world. ICTP and whatever money we can raise from other sources pays for their plane tickets. Some of them can get a little bit of money from their home departments. And they come and we spend a week together in this gorgeous location. And we talk about all sorts of aspects of a physics career. We try to keep the workshop focused on very relevant things. How do you negotiate? How do you make a CV that will get you into that graduate program or help you get a job? Many of them are already teaching before even getting the PhD, if the PhD is relatively rare in their home countries. So they may be both faculty and an aspiring PhD candidate all at once. We talk about teaching, but also things like workplace challenges, work life, transitioning between academe and industry, sort of all the practical things that people might need to think about in a career, and things that for some of the women, they may be the only woman on the faculty of their unit, but they may be also the only woman who has ever been a PhD candidate in their province. And the degree of isolation is just staggering. So where one comes home saying, we have it pretty good by comparison. There are more women around here. And the courage and determination of these women is just really, it's inspiring. And their dedication to physics, they love physics every bit as much as I do. And they talk about physics and give posters on physics during the workshop. And they find new collaborators there for their physics as well. We also use varied formats. There's a lot of interactive work here. The women are working together on giving each other feedback on their CVs after we've had a workshop that suggests what to look for in a CV. We have meals together. There are various discussion-based sessions. And we make sure that the speakers are from all around the world, from different areas of physics, different career stages, and so on. And that makes a difference as well. A number of the participants actually are part of some of the panels as well. The impact from the surveys that we've done show that people come away from this with new skills. They come away with a new determination to go teach others in their home country some of the things that they've learned. They'll, say, borrow some of the slides, get them from the website, and then go give lectures or workshops in their home country, which is fantastic. They've come back saying they feel more a part of the international community of physicists. In 2015, Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell was one of our keynote speakers, and she came and spent the whole week there, which was fantastic. And everybody got to meet someone they'd heard about in their textbooks, and there she was, live and excited and interested in them, which was fantastic. So that's been something that's really been tremendous in these recent years, and I'm looking forward to continuing that. If this is something that people would like to get interested in, like to get engaged in, we can always use more people to get involved, especially if we start doing these workshops in a variety of countries. So be in touch if that sounds interesting. The other application I wanted to talk about was work with LGBTQ physicists in the American Physical Society. And this goes back to Kate Kirby, the executive officer, who commissioned an ad hoc committee and charged us with looking at what was the current status of LGBT physicists in the society, because nobody knew. No one had looked at it. And she wanted to know, was the society inclusive? Was physics inclusive by this dimension? And if not, what could be done to potentially change that? In pulling together the committee, she drew heavily from a grassroots organization that I'm on the organizing board of, LGBT plus physicists. We have an online presence. We've written a resource guide for a best practices guide for physics and astronomy department chairs on what departments can actually do to create a more inclusive climate in very practical ways. So a number of us from that were in the committee. We did a lot of different things to gather information. We had some focus groups and roundtables at APS meetings. We did a big climate survey of physicists where we got quite a number of participants who identified as transgender as part of that, which was important since that's not always a very visible community in physics. And we had also among those surveyed, again, in addition to individuals identifying as men and as women, there were quite a number who identified as gender nonconforming or other. So we felt like we were able to get some diversity of experience. We also were able to get the APS to modify its own membership survey that it does regularly to to have some survey questions asking if people identify as part of the LGBT community, and specifically if individuals, you can see that some identified. Number of people, however, said that they didn't want to provide such information. What was interesting was the distribution by age. A much larger fraction of younger physicists openly identified as LGBT, and among more senior physicists, people were less likely to so identify and were more likely to say they didn't want to answer the question or to object to the question even being on the survey. And a number of the answers that were typed into the survey answer box were so rude and vitriolic that it kind of proved why the climate survey needed to be done in the first place, because clearly there was a lot of hostility. So we put together a report and submitted it to the APS, and they adopted it and agreed to implement its recommendations. I'll urge you to go look at it so you can get all of the full details. But and I'll take you through just a couple of the specific findings and outcomes. But I wanted to point out that among the group of authors, I was a full professor, and Michael Falk was a full professor. But the other people on the committee were junior faculty, postdocs, and even graduate students. And again, people with tremendous courage to work on these issues publicly at an early stage of their career. And I was honored to be able to support the group and lend a senior voice where it was helpful to do so. But in particular, Elena Long was the most junior. She was still a graduate student when we started the work, and then was a postdoc, now is a faculty member. She was really the driving force and the most junior among us. So the findings, so the overall climate, it turned out, that people would experience depended a lot on what you might call intersections of different parts of their identity. So while 15% of LGBT men encountered a workplace environment that was quite uncomfortable a lot of the time, LGBT women significantly more likely, and individuals who identified as gender nonconforming twice as likely to have a really uncomfortable department climate that they were encountering on a day-by-day basis. And similarly, when you look at the proportion who observed harassment in their department or workplace, again, a big difference between LGBT men, women, gender nonconforming individuals. So these intersections of different parts of identity were making a big difference. Turned out that we hadn't known necessarily beforehand, but it became very clear that a lot of people were finding that the social norms in their department were trying to force people to stay in the closet. That it wasn't cool to mention if you presented as male, it wasn't cool to mention that you had a boyfriend. That would give a lot of hostility. And that, it really wears on people when they can't be just open and honest about their life and who they are the way everyone else in the department can. It's not a good situation. And what people were saying about it was really pretty devastating. Things were so bad for a lot of people that a third, slightly more than a third, had actually strongly considered, just in the last year, leaving their school if they were students, or leaving their workplace, because the situation was really just that bad. And when you consider that these are individuals who are all doctoral students or postdocs or faculty or people working in industry, these are people who had already had years of training, passed many exams, clearly are talented physicists, and yet they were on the verge of being driven out of physics by this. So the first, just to jump to recommendations, the first recommendation we had was APS, make your meetings more safe and welcoming. And to their credit, the APS immediately did start writing codes of conduct for APS meetings that made it clear, hey, everyone at the meeting is supposed to be collegial and civil towards everybody else at the meeting. You can't just be rude and hostile and harassing to other people at an APS meeting. And they designated staff who would be publicly there at the meeting. And if you encountered a bad situation, there was a staff member you could just go talk to, and they would take care of it. And it just let people know that, okay, this is going to be a place where we're polite to one another and just all talk about the physics. So they took that on. And we had a number of other recommendations, but the last one was to establish an overarching forum on diversity and inclusion that would work on issues for physicists from a variety of communities that are traditionally less well represented in the field, to make sure that all of the different issues for the different communities are being addressed, but also, since people may be part of more than one of these communities, that there would be an overarching forum where the intersectionality aspects could also be addressed as well. And we're presently now, we have a committee that's working on writing a proposal and bylaws for implementing the forum, and I'm on that committee as well. So we were happy that the APS was willing to promote that idea. So my charge to you, you're already in the room. You're already acknowledging that these things are worth talking about. So, stand up for colleagues who work on these issues. Be one of those colleagues. Make sure that when you are making the choices of who's going to get an award or admission or advance in the field, that you're looking at the evidence about their actual accomplishments and not letting those voices in the back of the head just drive you to places you don't want to be. When people tell you about what their experience is, listen to them, believe them. It may be different than your experience, but that's what they've actually experienced. And it means something when somebody believes you, when you try to tell them about what it's like. And please do join the efforts to establish the forum. I'm easy to find, evc@ucsd.edu. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for being here, and there are resources on the last pages. Thanks a lot.
So thank you for an excellent talk, and the floor is open for questions or comments. Yeah.
The only graph that you showed where you compared physics to other disciplines, I think, was that % of women that got PhD and bachelor's degree, maybe just PhDs.
That one was PhDs. I have the bachelor's.
Yeah.
It looks kind of
No,
similar.
I'm just wondering, so their physics was similar as engineering and doing much worse in gender equity than other
everybody
fields,
else.
especially like chemistry and life sciences. So what do you have an insight into what the mechanisms are that cause that?
So part of it is that graph that shows that the more likely the practitioners are to believe that you need to be born brilliant in your field to succeed. Physicists, we believe that much more about our field than chemists and biologists do about their field. So that's one hint towards part of a reason.
So does that mean we're more discriminating?
It means that we carry this contradiction that we spend our lives teaching, but somewhere in our brains we think that only people who are born as special physicists, geniuses, can do physics, and that doesn't make any sense. But the biologists are less prone to that fallacy than we are, apparently, and that helps. There are other things in general. The part of biology that's more quantitative has fewer women than the parts of biology that are less quantitative. There are all sorts of gradations within individual fields as well. And yet mathematics does better than we do, because mathematicians, part of the reason is mathematicians apparently believe you can actually learn math and work hard and then become better at math. And we think you should be born knowing physics. So, yeah.
Where am I headed?
There's one between the back
And then one over here.
a couple of them are in the middle somewhere.
And I think one over here.
I'm over here.
Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned early on in the talk that you would often be the only female faculty member in a lot of your meetings. And right now, the national conversation is often centered around men making decisions for women in Congress and other places. And I wonder to what extent this happens or has happened in your experience. How prevalent you think it is and how much of an issue it is as we try to combat gender differences in physics?
So, sure, I mean, for the times when I was the only woman in the room, there must have been other times when I wasn't even there, so it was only the men making the decisions. I think if you ask most women, they've probably also experienced the being talked over, or you say something and then no one listens, and then 5 minutes later, the guy says the same thing and everyone listens. So there's a lot of that going on to the extent that you feel like you're not being heard. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the discouraging thing, is that goes on a lot. I remember a senior woman friend describing the process of graduate admission in her physics department, where this is a while ago, but where certain guys on the graduate admissions committee were tossing all the women's applications, just like they weren't even going to read them, and she was just like scooping them off the floor, reading them, and then shoving it back in their faces like, wait, look at this one, you know, this person is brilliant, we have to admit them. And feeling like if she hadn't been in the room, there just wouldn't have been any women grad students, which luckily she's a very strong person and didn't mind just scooping them off the floor. Yeah.
So as on your first slide, I think one of the big problems is getting people to actually admit that there's a problem.
Yeah.
In my experience, I think there are a lot of people who don't think there's a problem and provide about 10 reasons why it's not actually a problem. What are your suggestions for convincing people that these are actually problems that they should be thinking about?
So there are different arguments. I mean, some appeal to a sense of justice and fairness. People who are qualified ought to have a chance to go into the field that they want to be in and that they're qualified for. There's the sense that our field is missing out on a lot of talented people who are being kicked out for nothing. It has nothing to do with their talent. That's a waste. There are so many problems in the world that need the input of physicists to maybe make progress on. And if we're allowing talented physicists to be kicked out of the field, we're kind of undermining ourselves as a society. Sometimes one can appeal to individuals to say, look, how would you feel about it if it was your kid who wanted to be the physicist and was told they couldn't because, you know, their hair was the wrong color or they didn't look like a physicist? Would you really think this was a good thing? Some people hear it best in that way. Sometimes the best way to get the message across is if you find somebody whose opinion they respect, who thinks this is an issue, and who says, yes, this is an issue. And that's why it's important to have people like the university president or provost speak up, because people will usually say, okay, well, I at least kind of have to listen to them, and then maybe the mind opens up a little bit. It's hard because none of us like to be told we're wrong or told we're biased. Makes us feel bad. So it's hard.
Hi, I'm interested in hearing how you put together this, or some of the methodology on your APS committee. Did you work with a social psychologist to come up with survey questions or interpret the results, or?
Yeah. We.
I guess, how did you figure out what was the right thing to ask?
Yeah, absolutely. Here, I'm just going back to the report. Here we go. So, Ramon actually has a social science degree, and so he knew about the methodology. And so the rest of us, he had degrees both in physics and in social science, but so he helped with the survey. Some of the others also knew a bit about survey research from different kinds of volunteer work they'd done. And with Ramon, we could also check things with some of his contacts. And also, her name is there was another person from APS who was kind of an informal consultant with us as well. So we made sure that we had people who knew social science research to construct the survey, because yeah, otherwise it's a disaster. You ask something and you don't know how people will read it, and then the answers don't mean what you thought. So yeah, I should have stressed that.
Liz, thank you for speaking out. It's really important. There was one thing that I just wanted to ask. You had a plot that showed the leaving versus time of men and women with academic jobs, and there were women with married women and women with children or planning and so forth. And there was one of those curves was
these were people getting a
these
they were getting a tenure
Right.
system job.
exactly.
There.
Yes, and right there, the dotted line is the same, and I wondered
Yes.
how you could explain why single women with no child under 6, why are they leaving just...
So it's not leaving, they have the same likelihood of
Yeah.
getting that tenure track job. Well, and if the curve that didn't make it on here, I don't know why, but the curve for married men with no children is somewhere in between the top curve and the middle curve. So that's one thing that's shown up in a number of different strands of social science research, that the married men with a young child are actually doing better than the married men without a young child. And I don't know that anybody's really explained that one. It's odd.
Is that because they have the wife there at home and the people...
It's quite possible, only they're both married, so I don't know. It's not, I haven't heard any, I've seen the pattern in other studies as well, and I certainly don't recall anybody having a great actual explanation for it. The only thing I can think of is that this is anecdote, not data, but I've certainly heard of many instances where people will say, oh, but he really needs the raise because he has a family to support. And I've never heard them say that, anybody say that about a woman. And so there may be a little of that bias going. I don't know, but as I say, that's not data, that's anecdote.
In the context of like a graduate physics classroom, could you speak to any like specific best teaching practices that could help reduce identity threat?
So things like having people put a code rather than a name on an exam paper, so you're not reminded of your identity. Not using gendered language and speaking to the class. Don't use terms like you guys, for example. Not everyone in the room is a guy. Just use, hey, everyone, you all, that kind of thing. Which may sound silly, but my older child identifies as non-binary and says, yeah, when you say you guys, like that's not me, so don't do that. I said, okay, new language, better language. Making sure to, in class, have ways of inviting people to speak that make sure everybody gets invited to speak. Some people use, I've seen some people in small classes use playing cards, and will say, I'm going to invite everybody periodically to comment, to give a comment or a question. I'm going to call by card. You get a different random card each class. I don't know who the 2 of clubs is today. And so people know that at least some of the interaction with the professor really is truly random. It's just them as another physics student. So there are things like that that can help. Just generally trying to show respect for each person and not only talk to the people in the front row. That kind of thing. Yeah.
So one of the things that I worry about, I guess, in a physics career is wanting to be a successful physicist, but also wanting to be involved in advocacy, and the fact that those are 2 things that can take a lot of time. So one of the things that I hear sometimes from faculty members and other professional physicists is that they feel that it's important to focus just on your physics, and that just by being a great physicist, that will help to solve these gender issues, because when you become an advocate, you lose time working on your physics, and then maybe the rest of the community doesn't respect you as much. So I'm wondering, I guess, how you feel like you've balanced that in your career, and how like early career scientists like myself and a lot of the other people in this room can think about having both part of both worlds.
Sure. No, it's a great question. So I tend to have a couple different parts to the answer. One is, for some people, doing advocacy is something that they feel like at some point I would like to make time in my life for that, but it's not something that they feel a burning need to do right now. There's some people for whom they feel the way that I deal with maybe the stress that I have by, some sexist comments and things like that that I encounter, the way I'll deal with that is I will do a bit of advocacy, and that will help me feel a little more powerful in the space I'm in right now. And people who feel the second way, then maybe that's something really important to them, and to continue, maybe they really have to do some advocacy at that moment. And then it's a question of figuring out how to do it in a way that fits within the realities of 24 hours a day. But the realities of 24 hours a day are, we don't, most of us anyway, work 24 hours. I mean, we sleep, we have time for meals, there may be some silly television show that we like to watch, there may be concerts we go to or movies we go to. There are a lot of things we do that aren't actually physics. And so it may be, or maybe we only go to nerdy physics movies, I don't know. Jurassic Park had a lot of great non-physics in it. But so there's time that one is amusing oneself outside of doing physics, and one could make a substitution there, right? Maybe I'll go to one less movie a month and I'll do some advocacy work. Maybe the advocacy work I do will be online through something like LGBT+ physicists, where I can come and go over the year as I need to, because everybody kind of floats in and out a bit. Maybe I will not start my own new gender advocacy program at my institution, but maybe I'll find an existing group and join it, and I will contribute a little bit, but I won't be putting in huge time. There are different ways of managing it, that it doesn't have to take up all your time when it's a life phase when you have to spend a lot of your time writing your dissertation or something. But if it's something that you really need to do for peace of mind, then you ought to do it. I mean, I started doing this as a grad student because I needed to for my peace of mind. I know other people who started much later because that worked for them. They had other things that they were focusing on earlier. There's no one way. Yeah.
I don't imagine that childcare is the only reason that women who have kids are not doing as well. What do you think the other, factors are, and how can we as people fix that whole situation?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things. I mean, there are the things to do with negotiation. There are things to do with how job searches and scholarship awards are done, where anybody involved with those processes can try to make them more fair, so that they're more fair for women, they're more fair for people of different races and ethnicities, they're just more generally fair. There's a lot to do about process. There's a lot with mentoring, because people from groups that aren't part of the majority may they may not receive the same quality of mentoring unless somebody says, I'm going to make sure that every new faculty member has a mentor who's actually working with them and helping them connect with people. So there are a lot of different aspects like that that can make a big difference. I mean, that's one thing that we did in my college at Michigan State, is that we had uniformity of, there was a salary scale, there was a startup scale, there was a mentoring system that was the same for everybody. People could change mentors every year for no reason, just I want to add a mentor, or you know, our interests aren't as close as I thought, I should switch. And there was a lot of feedback around different aspects of their job all the time, so they were never left to wonder, how am I doing? They were always being told, oh, hey, you know, you're doing great in this. Hey, you should probably work a bit on this. So they weren't left to wonder. And that meant that women and men were progressing at the same rate, and people of different races and ethnicities were progressing at the same rate and put up for awards and things. The more you leave to the gut instinct or the unconscious back of the mind, sort of the worse. We had an awards process, for example. When I got there, the awards committee would sit around and say, oh, you know, who should we put up for this award? And they'd each think of their buddy. And I said, you know, this isn't really the way to do it. How about we make the awards committee be the people who will do the paperwork, and the nomination committee will be the faculty annual review committee. And right after they've read everybody's folder for the year, then when they've got everybody's great accomplishments in mind, then they'll say, who should we nominate for which award? And then suddenly, there was much more fairness in how people were getting nominated, because it wasn't just who you could recall. You could recall everyone because you just read all their folders. So, you know, things like that of changing process make a big difference.
Recently in Hollywood, women have been coming up against the men of Hollywood. I then read an article about there being a Harvey Weinstein problem in Wall Street. You previously mentioned experience with sexual harassment. Have you seen women giving into these advancements for the sake of their jobs, similar to Hollywood and now Wall Street?
So I'm certainly aware of highly publicized cases. The ones that I can remember off the top of my head from physics tended to actually, the ones I can remember were in the astronomy sector, but they were very well publicized. A number, I'm sorry to say, out of the University of California system, but all across academe, there has been coming to light in physics and astronomy and sociology and philosophy of particularly women graduate students for whom senior professors were forcing them into sexual relationships and basically quid pro quo. And when the graduate student realized this was not really the situation I signed up for, then the person would pretty much destroy their career, refuse to, give them, refuse to continue access to financial support or, recommendation letters or things like that. So there have been quite a number of highly publicized things like that in the news. Academe is not immune to that at all, I'm sorry to say. I think academe is finally starting to talk about it a bit and to ensure that there are consequences for people who have that kind of bad behavior and for administrators who don't pay attention. There are a couple highly publicized cases in the last couple years where administrators who had ignored blatant sexual harassment and assault situations at their universities, when it came to light, lost their jobs as administrators, which they should, because it's your job to pay attention, and it's the law. We have to. So.
One last question.
No, I don't have that.
So I think it's almost 15, so
Oh.
let's thank Liz